Hi, and welcome to episode 8 of this series, and this is the third part of what looks like it's going to be a 4-part series now, and this one is called The Hominids, and this is the third part in a series that's called The Rule of Evolution. Okay, so let's get started. Alright, so again, hominids first appear, well, it's said about 6 million years ago, but the hominids that appeared 6 million years ago are not really any different from just apes. So really 5 million years ago. And again, not coincidentally, that took 60 million years to evolve. And because evolution takes time. And so after the big meteor struck and the dinosaurs were wiped out, the only thing that was left were smaller dinosaurs, the small mammals, and then reptiles that were already sort of water living, sort of like alligators and things like that, and sturgeon in the seas. So what it did though is, since there was only like smaller dinosaurs and smaller hominids now, it sort of leveled, or smaller, mammals now, it sort of leveled the playing field. And then eventually though, mammals started to dominate, because mammals are more intelligent, and mammals have more intelligence than reptiles and any kind of an insect. And it's because of the gestation is inside, and it's a longer gestation, and so that allows more time for the brain to develop in the womb, and that's necessary. So if you lay eggs, then anything that's being contributed to the development of how that creature is going to be is already done once the eggs are laid. Whereas with mammals, they continue to be nurtured and to get nutrients from the mother all throughout its gestation period. So that's why mammals have more intelligence. And that's why any intelligent life anywhere in the world, or anywhere in the universe, is most certainly going to have to be a mammal, and nothing else. Okay, so eventually these small reptiles, small dinosaurs, evolved into birds that we have today, which fly with feathers and things like that. Pterodactyls and birds are not necessarily related. So as the mammals started to dominate the earth, they were kind of dominating the land, and so dinosaurs took to the sky, took to the air, living in the higher treetops, and became birds. Okay, so eventually hominids evolved about 5 million years ago, and that's what this lecture is called, is the hominids. And hominids now introduce a new feature to this whole evolution thing. So before, what gave you superiority in the pecking order and in the food chain was size. So big was important. And now we have a new feature, and it's called intelligence. And so with this new intelligence, that gave hominids a decided advantage. And apes never really evolved any kind of advanced intelligence. It was only hominids. And it really is what sets hominids apart from apes, is the higher intelligence, slightly larger cranium, and more brain development. Okay, now the closest relative that we have now are chimpanzees and not apes. So we're more descended from chimpanzees, but the reason why chimpanzees still exist and not hominids is because they were not a threat, whereas other hominids were definitely a threat, because they were too similar and also very intelligent. Okay, so we were talking about chimpanzees. And the reason why chimpanzees still exist and other hominids don't exist is because chimpanzees were not a threat to humans. They were smaller and had tails in some cases, and they weren't a threat. So they weren't, so you didn't get raided. Your camp didn't get raided by a pack of chimpanzees. Okay, they kind of stayed to themselves. So that's why they still exist. All right, so hominids now, about 5 million years ago. One thing that we know about ancient hominids is that, and maybe not 5 million years ago, but we do know that ancient hominids did bury their dead, and that they had ceremonies with these burials. They made weapons to be able to take on this megafauna that existed at 2.5 million years ago. And they had other tools, and they developed fire and cooking, and they even did artwork, so like the hand paintings and things like that. So now this was a whole other thing that competed with the animal kingdom, and intelligence was a decided advantage. Okay, now most hominids around the world evolved near the equator. Now the current school of thought is that Homo sapiens were the last evolution of hominids, and they evolved around 200,000 years ago, but around 160, 150,000 years ago they looked like us. So there's like, they turned into Homo sapiens sapiens. So in 50,000 years, like magic, boom, they went from hominids to Homo sapiens sapiens. That most certainly is not possible, not according to the rule of evolution. Okay, or any other rule. Okay, and so other hominids that were in Africa were Homo erectus, and it's believed that they eventually evolved into Homo sapiens. But that's not how I see it as happening. Okay. First of all, once hominids started to gain any kind of higher intelligence, that was the end of evolution as we know it with that species. Because now, before you have evolution, and that's done instinctively, instinctual. So when you take butterflies and you put them in a box with no light or whatever, and then after about a couple months or whatever, then you allow light in, and you find that all the butterflies have turned white. And that's evolution. That's how evolution works. And it happens instinctively. But once you add the element of intelligence, which hominids clearly had, now you've got conscious decisions. And you have conscious decisions that are overriding any kind of instinct. And that changes the whole trajectory and the whole path of evolution from then on. From that point on, that becomes the main feature. And that affects evolution all over the world, because as the intelligent species continues to evolve intellectually, it affects all other species, and animals become domesticated, other animals get wiped out that aren't deemed as necessary, whatever. Okay. So I feel like hominids actually appeared all over the world. Now we already know for sure that they appeared in Africa, but we also already know that we had hominids in Europe. And we had hominids in Southeast Asia, and those are called, that was Java man. But then we've also discovered Denisovans in Papua New Guinea, as well as Siberia. And so just for the Neanderthals to be in Europe, that says that hominids, well before they were man, migrated. So out of Africa of humans, great, but then hominids also went out of Africa in that case. Or maybe they didn't come out of Africa. And so we have Neanderthals in Europe, we have Java man in Indonesia, Java. Denisovans are in Papua New Guinea and also in Siberia, which proves that they traveled quite a bit. They probably emerged from the area of now Indonesia around Java, and then went over to Siberia and migrated up to Siberia. Then in India they discovered a hominid that's called Haratali Angar. And it's a hominid that they have discovered in around the Bengali region of Punjab region of India. Okay. So then comes the question of South America. And were they in South America? Well, the current school of thought is no, but we do have primates in South America. And again, the primates evolved near the equator. But we do have some evidence of hominids in South America. For example, we have footsteps that are determined to be at least 23,000 years old in New Mexico. Now, this is well before the period of the last interglacial period. So this is during the last ice age. So nobody was crossing any land bridge around that time. That wasn't happening. Not on the big icy glaciers. So where do these footsteps come from? Probably they came from hominids. Also, 18,000 years ago, we have found strong evidence of what's called Clovis people in Chile. And they were definitely hominids, and or at least, I mean, we think they may have even been like man, but they were definitely at least hominids. But that's 18,000 years ago. Again, that's before the time of the last interglacial period. So possibly you have hominids that evolved in South America as well. So why haven't we found them? Well, because near the equator, going across South America, I mean, it starts out with the beach, and then before there was all the development that they have now, there was the Amazon rainforest. Not very conducive to preserving organic organisms. Then when the Amazon ends, you've got stark mountains, in Peru and Ecuador and stuff. Stark, jagged mountains. And then when the jagged mountains end, it comes down, you get the beach again. So it's not exactly conducive to preserving evidence, or for archaeologists to even look for the evidence, because the terrain is so difficult that it's hard to even walk around there to even look for evidence. So, so there could have been hominids there. The other possibility, what we know for sure, there's primates. The other possibility is Australia. Now we've found traces, strong traces of Aboriginal cultures in Australia about 50,000 years ago. And ancient Aboriginals looked a lot like hominids. And it's said that they evolved into what they look like now. Now, the interesting thing about Australia is there's this thing in Indonesia called the Wallace Line. And the Wallace Line is a very distinctive line that divides fauna and foliage and all living things between Southeast Asian and basically Australia and the Oceania, okay? And so basically, Papua New Guinea has kangaroos, and Australia, so marsupials and anything like that. And so it also has to do with the eucalyptus leaves and things like that. And it's all like Australia. And so that obviously was joined together at one point. So it was obviously separated at one point, and then obviously it joined together at one point. And at the time that it joined together is probably the time when man kind of migrated from Southeast Asia, probably in Indonesia, and migrated across the land bridge down into Australia. And obviously that happened way before the out of Africa thing happened. Okay, so you have all these hominids now all around the world, and we've got Denisovans, which are in Asia. We've got Homo erectus, which turned into Homo sapien, that's in Africa. We've got Neanderthals in Europe. And that also corresponds with the, and this again is not PC, but it very much corresponds with the three major races. We have Caucasian, we have African, and we have Asian. And the reason why those three races evolved is pretty clear, and the reason is because of significant geological obstacles. And so when we talk about like African Americans, what we're really talking about is sub-Saharan African, because the Sahara Desert is a huge obstacle that obviously prevents a lot of migration into Europe, as well as once you go north of there, you've got the Mediterranean Sea. So it's not that easy to migrate out of Africa. You have to go basically through Egypt, which is a desert. Going across Egypt, that's not easy. You have to go, to go from Sudan through Egypt, you're walking through the desert, unless you're just walking along the Nile and that's it. But you would have to know that the Nile was good. If you didn't have that knowledge, anybody else that tried to go across the desert probably didn't make it. And then even once you get to the Mediterranean Sea, to get to the point of where you could get into Europe, you have to now go across the Sinai and the mountains, and that's not easy to do either. And even once you get into the Levant, it's still not very conducive to migrating. So, and maybe they had boats well, probably not 100,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago. So that was a significant obstacle. The other obstacle is, of course, the deserts of the Middle East. That was an obstacle. But the other major obstacle, of course, is the Himalayas. And like I said, the Himalayas are significant. It's not just Tibet and Mount Everest. Even all the way up into Siberia, Kyrgyzstan still has 25,000-foot mountains. And so the entire mountain range is basically 20,000-foot mountains. And that's quite an obstacle. And that's what kept Asians on the east side of that obstacle, and it keeps basically Caucasians, I guess, on the west side of that obstacle. And if you go to Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan today, they're very definitely more Caucasian than anything else. It's like Europe collides with Asia right there at the Himalayas. All right. And so we know that hominids migrated. And hominids also would have encountered the same obstacles too. Now, about 2.6 million years ago, we discovered that hominids started to eat red meat. And around 2.5 million years ago is when all the megafauna emerged. And so there was lots of red meat to eat. And so this is one of the things that motivated them to try to eat the red meat, because it was a great food source and there was a lot of it. But we also have noticed and discovered that they were getting to be pretty intelligent, sophisticated at that time. They were able to carouse the megafauna into pens. They could chase them into areas where the trees were so tight that the megafauna couldn't get through the trees. They chased them up against cliff faces. They chased them to the edges of cliffs. All sorts of methods to cage them in without building fences in order to make hunting a lot easier. And that, of course, was just using intelligence. And that's where their superior intelligence gave them a huge advantage. Then around 1.5 million years ago, there was some evolution and some incisors start to emerge. And that's why today we are called omnivores. All humans today are omnivores. That means that we can eat everything. Which is why, no matter what happens with global warming, we'll still be around. Because it may change our diet dramatically, but we'll still be around. Because whatever is still, because life will evolve. Life will adapt. And whatever life there is, we will learn how to eat it. So we'll get to that later. Okay, so at about 780,000 years ago, there's solid evidence that mankind invented fire, or that discovered fire, and that they were using it for cooking meat. And not only is 780,000 years ago, well before Homo sapiens, so they're obviously just hominids, it's also in Israel. It's when they discovered this. And so that's proof that hominids were in Israel. But we don't know what kind of hominids they are, because we haven't found any traces of the hominids. We just found traces of what's been left over, the fire pits and things like that. Okay, so once we have hominids and we have the kind of intelligence that I'm talking about, that can herd megafauna against cliff faces and bury their dead, and can cook and make tools and weapons and things like that. And they have ceremonies with burying the dead and things like that. So some sort of religious observation, I guess, was taking place. It then became about crossbreeding and not evolution. And as we know, hominids obviously had to crossbreed, or else there wouldn't be any Neanderthals in humans. There's probably, once we find more complete skeletons of like Denisovans or Java man or whatever, we'll probably find that there's traces and there's DNA genetic markers from other hominids in other humans as well. We just don't know what those markers are, because we're not looking for them, because we don't know what to compare it to. We don't know what the other hominids had as far as genetic markers goes. And the reason why it became crossbreeding and not evolution anymore is because now it's become a conscious decision as opposed to instinct. And conscious decisions so overrides everything. Okay, and so now remember I was saying that life experiments. So as there were hundreds of species and subspecies of apes, there was also probably hundreds of species of hominids that were evolving. And not just one. And so and they would also be very, very distinctive looking from each other. Very, very distinctive looking from each other. And so there was probably a lot of conflict between all these different hominids. And there was probably a lot of crossbreeding between the different hominids. And I'll get to that a little bit later. Okay, so now we have Homo sapiens 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens sapiens 160,000 years ago. Not enough time. Okay. So in the Middle East, South America, okay, so why can't we find these hominids in, let's say, the Middle East? Well, because, and what I think is that the hominids were all over the world, and that they were migrating and crossbreeding all the time, commonly. So, okay, why can't we find, and I think a lot of them were in the Middle East, because that's kind of the middle of where all this was taking place. And so you've got Java man and Denisovans coming across. You've got Homo sapiens coming up. You've got Neanderthals in Europe, okay, and they're all interbreeding, and they're all mixing. And the reason why I think that we don't find any hominid remains is a couple of reasons. Number one, again, the environment is just not conducive to preserving organic organisms, and so that's why we can't find them. But the other thing is that they there was a period of probably hominid hybrids. Okay, now again, when we talk about evolution, we talk about time. It takes a lot of time for these things to happen. And so to say that, you know, blonde hair and blue eyes and white skin evolved, you know, in let's say 50,000 years is just ridiculous. That didn't happen. It was crossbreeding is what happened. And so where were they crossbred from? Who are the hominids that had blue eyes and blonde hair? Probably they came from the Middle East. That's my guess. And they evolved and emerged, and that's what ultimately led to that. But again, we know that it's all crossbreeding, and it's and so it's a product of crossbreeding and not instinct and not evolution more than anything else. Okay, now I'm not a geneticist, but I do know that some things are impossible, so like I think it's even more so if there's two blue-eyed people, they can't have a brown-eyed child because brown eyes are not recessive or something like that. I'm not exactly sure how it works, but I do know that some things are impossible. And so it has to come from somewhere. There has to be a source for it. It has to be a recessive gene somehow that had to get into the DNA somehow, and it didn't just evolve. Because mutations are rare, and we don't really find any. There really aren't any mutations in the world, you know, like for the appendix, for example. We haven't needed an appendix or even our wisdom teeth for at least 1 million years. Once we began cooking the meat and making it softer 780,000 years ago, we didn't really need an appendix or wisdom teeth for that much anymore. But that's never evolved out of us. And the reason why is because it's not necessarily an advantage or a genetic advantage to not have an appendix. You know, I mean, what were they going to do? You know, they're going to, you know, hey, baby, you know, I was born without an appendix. That's right. Yeah, I was. That means that gives me a genetic advantage. Yeah, I don't think that happened. And we'll get back to that later on too. Like say, so you need time for things like this to evolve. Okay, so so now we have the period of what I call the hybrids, and that probably started around 1 million years ago, but probably increased over time. So 300,000 years ago, I think, is when it started to get really big and extensive. Lots of crossbreeding, and there's lots of hybrids. Now, why can't we find any of these hybrids? Well, again, for the same reasons. Not only because most of them are going to probably be in the Middle East, and not only is the area not conducive to preserving organic organisms, but also hybrids don't last for very long, because when you're crossbreeding, about 4 generations, and then it can get pretty blended again. And so it's hard to find it's hard to find examples of something that really only existed for maybe 100 or 200 years or something, crossbreeds or hybrids. We're finding dinosaurs because they were around for 100 million years, but something that was around for maybe a few hundred years, good luck finding an example of that. So that's another reason why we can't really find the hybrids. But I believe that we had them. And I believe that mostly the hybrids were in the Middle East, and I think this is no coincidence that that's where civilization eventually began as well. Okay, so you've got, so we know that some crossbreeding happened. We know that there was a lot of migration that happened, and we know that hominids were intelligent. In fact, we found hand paintings, and coincidentally we found hand paintings in Spain 40,000 years ago. And we found very similar looking hand paintings in Indonesia around the same time, 40,000 years ago. And a learned, scholarly friend of mine who's got 2 doctorate degrees quipped and has actually taught in some of his lessons, classes that he's taught, that maybe it was made by the same guy. I mean, it's the same kind of artwork, it's the same style. Maybe it was the same person. It's not impossible to walk from Spain into Indonesia, especially if there's a land bridge. I mean, it takes a long time, but a year or 2? I mean, there's plenty of time for somebody to have done that. So to give you an idea of the kind of migration that has always been taking place, they were migrating back and forth all across Eurasia and then down into Africa as well, and then when there was a land bridge there, they went down into Africa. I mean, down in Australia too. And so there was always migration happening, even during the time of the last interglacial period, which would have been like 115 or 130,000 years ago. There was a lot of migration at that time as well. Okay, and so with all this inbreeding and crossbreeding, okay, this is where tribalism comes out. And we still see tribalism today. And because if you can imagine the difference between like a white person and a black person is kind of a difference, but if you can imagine the difference between 2 different kinds of hominids, the differences were stark and traumatic. And so the idea of this is us and they're them, and even though we could crossbreed, it was probably highly discouraged. And any woman that voluntarily did it was probably outcast or whatever. But the reason why you had a lot of crossbreeding was because you had a lot of raiding. And so, you don't have laws, you don't have an infrastructure, and so you've got basically one tribe of hominids thinks this other group of hominids has some pretty looking women, and they come in and they raid, and they kill off the men, and they steal the women. And that's how most of the crossbreeding has happened. And a lot of times it wasn't successful. It was probably a lot more successful to breed within your tribe, but there were still examples that survived. That's even the same today. That's why they used to make you get a blood test when you get married, because certain blood types didn't mix very well, and you often had stillbirths and things like that with the wrong blood types. Medicine's a little bit better now. Now we don't have those kinds of restrictions, but for many, many years we did have those restrictions. But we still see tribalism even today. And tribalism is in the form of today, so like you'll see like if you go to like a football game, and you've got like Bronco fans, and they're like, yeah, Broncos, yeah, gonna paint my face orange, yeah, go Broncos, yeah, beat those guys, and then they're playing the Raiders, and their fans are all painted in silver and black, and they're going, yeah, Raiders, yeah, all right, Raiders, beat those guys, and they're all cheering and going crazy. And I think this is, football games are interesting part of sociology is the only place where you can paint your face orange or paint your face silver and black and scream at the top of your lungs for 2 hours and not be put into an insane asylum. Because if you did that in a shopping mall, they'd come and get you and take you away. So, you know, anyway. Alright, so we still see tribalism today. But tribalism is a lot less than it was. It was a lot worse 5,000 years ago. So 5,000 years ago, we've got Shalmaneser, and we've got another guy, his name began with a Arkabakia. I can't remember what his name is anymore. But these are guys who ruled during earliest civilizations, Sumeria, things like that. And they've written on obelisks, basically, you know, I smite the Armenians and I have utterly destroyed them. So he's bragging and he's boasting about how he's the great mighty leader, and he wiped out entirely an entire race of people, the Armenians. He didn't kill them all, but he said that he did. And he was proud of it. He was like, yes, I eliminated that entire race of people because I am the great Shalmaneser III. Yeah, yes, you know. And we've seen these on obelisks and different things that examples of that we found of writing, where it was a good thing. It was a good thing to have utterly destroyed the other group of them. And now, today, we don't have the same view. You know, it's not viewed upon as acceptable as this, you know, yeah, I killed them all, yeah, yeah, you know, I hate white people, I'm going to kill them all, yeah, I hate black people, I'm going to kill them all, I hate Asians, I'm going to kill them all. You wouldn't get very far with that kind of an attitude. And even during the time of World War II, when you have the Jews with the Holocaust and the mass extermination of Jews that the Germans did, after the war, the Germans knew that they were wrong, that they had been bad, and that other people wouldn't be very impressed with that. And so they tried to cover up any evidence that there was that it had ever taken place. And so, you know, and there's still deniers to this day, of course, but in Germany now if you deny, it's actually illegal, but or you can lose your job. But but at least we know that in the 1940s they knew it was wrong. And it wasn't something that they shouted from the tops of mountains and said, hey, we smited them utterly, and we killed them all, yeah, we killed all the Jews, yeah, we're great, we're the best. They knew that that was nothing to boast about. In fact, it was something to hide and not allow anybody else to see evidence of. So obviously, humans today are a lot different than they were even 5,000 years ago, as tribalism is getting to be less prevalent. But obviously, it was a very big part of men, and the reason why we have tribalism is because of this period of crossbreeding and the period of the hybrids, the hybrid hominids, and so that's why that exists to this day. And so the key to hominid success, why did Homo sapiens sapiens emerge, is that actually we were the most, we had the most diverse gene pool is what happened. And so eventually, the key to hominids, to migrating hominids, is that. Okay, so I would like to get back to tribalism for a second. So the thing about tribalism is tribalism makes living harmoniously very difficult, even today. So you've got a lot of strife that's happening on the earth, and a lot of that is all due to tribalism. Whether it's that you are another race, you're a gypsy, a Jew, black person, Asian person, or it's a religion, you're Protestant, you're Catholic, you're Muslim, whatever. We have a lot of problem with tribalism still. And hopefully in future that will blend itself out. Okay, so basically we have all these hominids all now interbreeding, and so what's the key to hominid success? So eventually what you have is you've got hominids that, now of course it was an advantage to be bigger, stronger, smarter, having more advanced technology. Those things were all important. But the most important thing was to have a more diverse gene pool. And so the more crossbreeding that you have, and the hominids that were the most crossbred were going to be the hominids that were going to emerge and that were going to be the strongest. And the reason why is because as they crossbreed more and they have a wider gene pool, you've also got a resistance to recognizing a wider variety of diseases, and you've got a wider variety of antibodies and things like that naturally. And we've seen some evidence of this in history, recorded history, not that long ago. When the conquistadors conquered the Americas, Mexico, and in Peru, sure, they murdered a lot of them, and they had superior technology and things like that, but the thing that overwhelmingly killed about 85% of all of the Incas and the Aztec Indians that died was mainly smallpox, but it was also other diseases. And it was that the conquistadors encountered new diseases that they had never seen before that existed in the Americas, but because they had actually more diverse gene pool, they were able to fend off those diseases a lot easier. And the Indians who did not have a diverse gene pool were vulnerable to the smallpox and the diseases that were brought to them by the conquistadors. And the reason why they had a smaller gene pool is because they are a product of coming across a land bridge from Asia into the Americas. And that land bridge only existed for about 3,000 years. And when it went away, everybody that migrated stopped. There was no more migration. And so the 100,000 or so people that migrated in that period of time form the entire base of the genetic gene pool that there was that spread and multiplied all through the Americas. And so they had a very limited gene pool, whereas the European conquistadors were a product of lots of crossbreeding throughout all millennial, and they had a much more diverse gene pool that gave them a tremendous advantage. Okay, and so ultimately, with these hominids, you have interbreeding, and interbreeding. Like I said, a lot of it in the Middle East, and you have more and more interbreeding until finally you have humans that we know today, Homo sapiens sapiens, emerge. And like I say, the first ones that emerged were about 150, 160,000 years ago, and obviously there were still a lot of hominids on the earth during that time. And so it was up until about 12,000 years ago before the last hominids were, as far as we know, were eliminated. And that wasn't really that long ago. And so we have this period of where humans exist 150,000 years ago until the last hominids 12,000 years ago. We've got a lot of fighting in the meantime. And especially we have fighting during the interglacial periods, because during the periods of the Ice Age, which was about 85,000 years in between, we don't have as much migrating. And so we don't have as much problem with the fighting and things like that. We still have a lot of friction. There's still that, it still exists, but it's not nearly as much as what happened after the last Ice Age went away and we had the last interglacial period. And when that happened, then we had a really violent period. So from about 15,000 years ago to about 12,000 years ago, we probably had the most violent period ever in human history. Because now not only do you have migrating is going crazy, and you've got massive fighting amongst all the different humans and all the humans and hominids, but eventually we eliminated all the hominids, and we also, during that time, killed off most of all of the megafauna that existed at that time. And so there were so many hominids and humans that existed, and they were so advanced by that time that they, in just 3,000 years, were able to eliminate something like 90% of all of the megafauna that lived. And in fact, saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths and the huge bisons in Europe became totally extinct, mostly at the hands of humans. And so there was a very violent time. Okay, so now why? So that's why we have no more hominids, because as long as we had any kind of hominid, they were a threat. Even though they weren't as smart as Homo sapiens sapiens or humans today, they were still a threat. And so they were eventually all eliminated. Now we still have apes and we still have chimpanzees, but they were never really a threat, and so that's why we left them alone. And then eventually you have the Pacific Islanders that were all populated in the South Pacific, and people will ask, well, what about them? Well, they're actually pretty phenomena, pretty recent history, maybe about 1,500 years ago, mostly from around the area of the Philippines, because they're mostly kind of descended from Filipino. They developed sophisticated enough boats that they were able to sail across the Pacific and reach all these various different islands, including Easter Island. And most of those civilizations are no more than, say, 1,500 years old. So that was a fairly recent phenomenon. Okay. And so basically, so to recap, basically we have this period of hominid interbreeding, and we have a period of the hominid hybrids and mass migration and fighting that's going on all over the Eurasia and into Africa and even down in Australia, and maybe a little bit of it happening in the Americas as well. It certainly happened in the Americas about 15,000 years ago, when you have the people emigrating across the land bridge 15,000 years ago, and they encountered the hominids that were already there, massive fighting, and quickly the hominids were extinguished. Okay. So basically, I guess that wraps it up for this episode. And this was episode 3 in the series on the rule of evolution. This was called the Hominids. Stay tuned for the next episode, which is episode 9 in the series 4, and the last episode of this particular series. And that's going to be on basically the future and life in other places in the universe. Okay, and so until then, we'll see you at that time. This is Scott Powers Houston for Learning with Power. See you next time.